Oh, hello, everybody. This is Denise Stephens, Chair of the DPLA Board, and we still have people trickling in to the waiting room. So we're going to hold on another 15 to 30 seconds to get started, and we will get the program underway very shortly. Thank you.
All right, Denise, that should be good.
Yeah, I think we're going to go ahead and get started today. And welcome everyone who's joining us on the call today. We have a good number of folks participating, about 118 so far and counting. So I think we have a very interested and hopefully a very interesting meeting today. Wanted to start by asking the board members present to just quickly introduce themselves to the audience.
I'll have a go. My name is Nico Fund. I'm the president and academic publisher of Oxford University Press in the USA.
I'll go next. I'm Felton Thomas. I'm the executive director of the Cleveland Public Library.
Hi, this is Elaine Westbrooks. I'm the vice provost and university librarian at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill.
And again, I'm Denise Stephens. I'm vice provost and university librarian at Washington University in St. Louis and acting as chair of the board today. At this time, I'd like to ask John Bracken to start our program with the update from the director.
Thank you, Denise. I see at least two more of our directors that I just want to let's say hi. Jenny Lee. And from
I'm Jenny Lee.
Hi, Jenny. I see you out there, and I think we see Jill as well.
Hi, how's everyone?
Jill joining us as the director of San Jose Libraries. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the board. Denise, thank you. You know, this is obviously an important meeting and time for all of us. It was a month and a day ago that George Floyd was killed. As with all of you, that event, the protests, the uprisings, the dialogue, the continued social movement that is Black Lives Matters that have been taking place since has impacted all of us here at the staff level at DPLA. In particular, I want to speak to how it's prompted us to reflect on our mission. We are uniquely privileged to have a mission focused on ensuring equity and access to knowledge for all as we make a transition into the digital age. And you know, often it's easy when one has a mission to fall back and words become bumper stickers. Part of my process through the last several months, and in particular the last 31 days, is a reflection on how powerful and important equity and access are, what they really mean, and and the urgency of ensuring that they're not just words and they're not just a mission statement for us. They're the guideposts of what we do. And as we go forward, and I think we're all reflecting, I think lots of us are reflecting in this moment, and there's so many statements and issuances of commitments happening, and we're not separate from that. We made the commitment, starting with a board statement around renewing our commitment around equity and inclusion and underlining the anti-racist need and urgency of our moment, living up to legacies that projects like ours have too often come from. But we also know that words are just the beginning, and that really what matters, the impact is the impact we're going to have and the actions we're going to take. And so I just want to underline that as a starting point. At the beginning of April at DPLA, at the real beginnings of the disruptive moments of the COVID experience nationally, we launched a 90-day plan to focus our work. And I just want to touch on those briefly, share with you some things we have coming up before handing it over to our guests, John and Tracie. So we're wrapping up that 90-day plan now, and here are a couple of the items that we've been focused on. One is we have been developing an archival initiative around Black women's suffrage, focused on lifting up the role of African-American women in and outside of the suffrage movement. We think it's a vital opportunity, an important opportunity to tell the story of African-Americans' history in the activism that has gotten us to this point. And today, I'm able to highlight 5 partnerships, 5 digitization partnerships that are growing out of that, that are the core to that work. With the Amistad Research Center at Tulane, with the Woodruff Library at Atlanta University Center, with the Avery Research Center at the College of Charleston, with Tuskegee University, and with, close to my heart, Southern California Library in Los Angeles. We're really excited for that work to be able to partner with such august institutions. And we're thankful to Pivotal Ventures for enabling that work. Second, ebooks and ensuring that all Americans have access to digital materials and books and digital content has been a core part of our mission. And I think the moments and the experience and the insights we've gained over the last few months also adds an urgency to that work. One thing we decided to do was to take the public domain ebook collections that we had developed, largely for libraries and librarians, and make them public facing in an intentional way for readers. So you may have seen freebooks.dp.la, where we're featuring those books and growing them. And I guess one thing to add is that in coming months, we will be adding more public domain collections and materials growing out of the events of the last few months and building off of the practices we developed, building a book around the Mueller report and on the impeachment papers. So really leveraging public domain documents into books and making them accessible, making urgent public domain documents easily accessible for folks. We also, like so much of what we do is collaborative, and we were able to grow our curation cores. The curation core is a group of over a dozen librarians across the country who help us develop and nurture the collections that we have in ebooks. And so I want to thank that crew who really just jumped in with us in the last couple of weeks. And I want to give a special thank you to Brianna Furkron, who's been leading that work for us, and I'm excited to see that grow. The last bit I'll say about ebooks is audiobooks are now accessible for DPLA materials through the Simply e-app, and that is 100% credit, high five to our friends and partners at New York Public Library for making that happen. And it's really, really exciting. And I can just from the handful of faces I can see shaking their hands, I know it's been a hot moment of a desire for lots of folks. And just to underline on the ebooks work, our thanks goes to Sloan Foundation, which is what allows us to be able to do that work. One growing new project that we've launched this year is really intentionally thinking about Wikipedia as a platform and as a resource, and making it easier for our contributors to have their materials seen and used and accessed within the Wikipedia and Wikimedia community. Early this year, DPLA became the top contributor to Wikimedia Commons, which means that the goal we have of building intentional upload and synchronization processes so that our partners' materials can more easily be used by editors and others inside of the Wikimedia environment. We're on that path, and we're really excited to grow that in the coming months. I should say that we did a webinar with Wikimedia Foundation, kind of outlining that work for our community earlier this quarter, and that link is out there somewhere, and Kat, through the magic of the internet, might throw that into the chat right now. The last bit I want to just highlight before telling you about what we're up to this summer is our members network. Our Hubs members network has been developing a policy to ensure the creation of more inclusive and diverse collections. And this is part of a conversation we've been in as a community for a while, living up to a commitment to dismantle systemic racism in our institutions and in our practices. And the statement, which Ann Hanlon, I should give the credit to, at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, has really helped shepherd through, is in front of the network, our network council at its meeting next month. And I think the impact, again, the actions that will result from that will be more inclusive and diverse collections. And so we're excited to see that impact come to the fore. And I should say that work, all of the work of our Hubs network and the conversations we're able to have and the community gathering we're able to do as a national entity is enabled by Mellon Foundation. So we're thankful for that. So this is a significant summer, I think, for all of us. And we have 3 events in July so far that I want to lift up to you, and I think you'll see some links to in the coming weeks and months and maybe even minutes. On July 9th, we are bringing together a set of conversations between librarians and publishers to talk about new collaborative approaches to ebook licensing. So we've been at the center of helping to think through and develop and experiment with new models of ebook licensing. And so we're really excited to be able to present a dialogue between librarians such as Kelvin Watson from Broward County, Cindy Aiden from the State Librarian of Washington, and Andrew Medlar from Book Ops in New York, along with Adam Silverman from HarperCollins and Mallory Bontrager from IPG from the Independent Publishers Group. And we're thankful for Lisa Peet for Libraries Journal, who's going to be part of that conversation with us. That's July 9th. My next plug is July 16th. We're really excited to be able to offer up a webinar focused on gender politics and history, reconstructing visibility of Black women's activism. This will go into greater detail about the Black women's suffrage archival work that I mentioned. We're going to have a keynote from Allison Robinson, right here from the University of Chicago, Aisha Hakel from the Avery Research Center at the College of Charleston, and Sarah Tanner from Atlanta University Center Woodruff Library will be there with us. And I should say, July 16th, for you historians and American historians in the room, know that it also is time to be a celebration of the birth of Ida B. Wells. So we're excited to have that in July. Last bit, and then I'm going to get off the stage for our guest, but I will shout out at least 2 of the other board members who I've seen pop in. On July 22nd, for our Hubs members, we're going to have a webinar presentation on right statements. This is our work that actually was originally funded by Knight Foundation, I should say. And it's being led by our right statements working group, ensuring that we are setting up our materials and our partners' materials in a way to maximize use and make it easier for people to access material. And Wendy Gogol from Harvard and Molly Huber from Minitex from the Minnesota Digital Library are the co-chairs of that work. So that's what we've got lined up for July. I hope you'll come back for more. And I'm going to come back in at the end of, after we hear from Felton and John and Tracie, to help facilitate questions you might have. If you have questions, I'm going to find what the right box is. Q&A. Please head to the Q&A box as I hand things over to, I mean, I just want to, I gushed already to them, but I feel so lucky and thankful to be able to have John Palfrey, the president and CEO of MacArthur Foundation, and Tracie Hall, the head of the American Library Association. They're two leading lights. They both, the most recent DPLA staff retreats, we were able to spend time individually with each of them, and you're in for a treat. So I'm going to get out of the way. Before I do want to say, Catherine Marr from our board is here from Wikimedia Foundation, CEO of Wikimedia Foundation, and Laura DeBonis, I saw sneak in a masked Laura DeBonis, I should say. So with that, I'm going to hand over the mic. I think, John, I'm handing it to you first.
John Bracken, thank you. It is such a treat to be here with all of you. I love seeing this great board in person here, and then also all the attendees who have joined. Thank you for making time for DPLA. Tracie and I have been really psyched to be with you. I know that Tracie is the main event, so I'm going to be really brief and we'll go back and forth. But it is super exciting for me to be back here as one of those who was at the start of DPLA, and really to see how far it's come in 10 years and really the new directions it has taken and the ways in which so many different people have stepped up to make this collaborative effort such a success. So congratulations to Denise, the board chair, all the board members, to John and all the staff at DPLA, and every one of the participants who have joined today and who are contributing in so many different ways to make something out of nothing into a really, really powerful and important institution. And one, as John said, that I think can and will rise to the occasion of this moment, where everyone in this country and indeed around the world is reckoning with many things, race certainly among them, but also the many ways in which we are connected and need to be more connected. And I just see libraries as so central to that effort, and DPLA as connective tissue and as supportive tissue to make that possible. So Tracie and I will go back and forth on a couple of topics. To be welcomed with a chance to talk about equity, access, and the future of reading seems pretty awesome. And we thought we'd start with the future of reading. It seems to me that the COVID moment is such a powerful one in the sense of so many physical libraries on which school children and new entrants to the country and really people from every walk of life have relied, not being there and having to do homework and having to look for jobs and to do all the things people do in libraries, but with the opportunity to show up at a library to be closed. And Tracie, I wonder if we might start there on the future of reading and your thoughts on how libraries have responded in this moment and what you're seeing from your amazing new perch at the ALA.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just want to, before I get into that, I'm just excited to be talking with you, John. And, I'm thanking you for all of the questions that you're raising, around philanthropy, and, when we operate from places of privilege, what our responsibilities are, our social responsibilities. And I'm really grateful for your interest in libraries and information access, because having also worked in philanthropy, I would say that one of the areas of work that's paramount for me, and, I join John and DPLA in this, is surfacing the importance of libraries as a part of our social infrastructure and as a bridge to true democratic engagement. And I feel like that conversation really needs to be directed towards philanthropy, because I do think that there is a lot of work to do there. I would say that when we talk about the future of reading, you, in your recent editorial in the Tribune, you talked about the twin urgencies of our responses and community recovery in the era of both the pandemic and also, I think, a global reawakening around racism and racial violence that I think is like long overdue and is probably something that there are communities that really, in some ways are being politicized in a new way and actually being escorted into a world that people who live in discernibly Black and brown bodies, indigenous bodies, people of color experience, every day, right? So there's something there. What I'm thinking a lot about when I think about the future of reading is that I'm really still hung up on this notion of enfranchisement, right? Because we think about just like the 4 freedoms, and there's E.J. Josie, who was an African-American activist, Black activist within the American Library Association. He founded 50 years ago this year the Black Caucus of the American Library Association, and I'm a member of that as well as the American Library Association. But I came into librarianship when he was older, and actually when I first worked at ALA, used a lot of his writings to inform some of the policies that I wanted to put in place. But in 1964, talking about the future of reading, one of the things that he talked about is that he talked about Roosevelt's 4 freedoms, right? President Roosevelt's freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear, and he introduced the ability to read as the 5th freedom. And it is that notion that reading is a human right that kind of buoys me into, I think, this era of practice as a librarian, as an administrator, and foremost as an activist. So when I think about from the perch of the American Library Association, and also DPLA's interest in ebooks, I'm thinking about, how just here in Chicago, in the early stages of the pandemic, Chicagoans checked out about a 51%, they were responsible for a 51% increase in ebooks being checked out from Chicago Public Library. So what I'm thinking about is, when I think about the future of reading, I'm thinking, of course, about a couple of things. Digital literacy being paramount, right? And we're going to talk more about that. Platform and device affordance. Who has access to platforms and also to devices? Because those two things are connected. I'm thinking also about content creation and resonance. So I think right now, I can say a lot more about that, but I think, obviously DPLA is talking about content creation. At ALA, that has been really the focus of our work, making sure that we were also helping people, helping authors, helping writers also get into containers and be represented in containers so that their work actually can be found. And then I want to stress also curation, wayfinding, and scaffolding. All of those things are works of libraries and librarians. And when I think about the future of reading, I think about that continuum, because some will stop, just at Wi-Fi. And we'll talk about that, because I'm a big proponent of universal broadband, and I believe that that's our unfinished business when it comes to the future of reading. We cannot talk about the future of reading without talking about that particular platform. But I'm thinking about all of those things. But I wanted to ask you, in relationship to the future of reading, something that I've been watching very closely here in Chicago is the way in which, when we began to talk about the contagion rates when it came to COVID-19 and the difference in zip codes. So I live far south now. I live in the Pullman area, right? Pullman is a subset of a community within Roseland. And when you looked at the contagion map, when you looked at where the recorded cases of COVID-19 were, it goes from that kind of like pale salmon to that deep red. I live in a deep red territory, right? A deep red neighborhood. And, I can remember, wearing a mask and having one of my neighbors say, "Where'd you get that?" And I'm like, "There's a giveaway, And he's like, "Well, how are you finding it?" And I'm like, "I'm finding it using my cell phone, my laptop, my iPad." But and I said, "You have one?" And he's like, "Yeah, but how do I find out about it?" And that's when I was thinking about what even public health in Chicago, our department talked about, that it was a lack of digital access and digital literacy that they that they believed was really complicating the idea to, public health in Chicago and the disparity there. You have spent some time talking about that. MacArthur is investing. Can you talk a little bit about why you are so invested in the future of reading and why you may see it also as a community health or a public health issue?
Tracie, thank you. Yeah, that's incredibly inspiring and totally right, I think, in terms of how we think about these issues as just deeply connected. And I think it is just a fundamental kind of equity question. The COVID crisis, of course, laid bare some of these inequities in Chicago, but not in any ways that would surprise anybody who was paying attention before. And it just lit up heat maps in a different way. And I think the point is you've just got inequity on top of inequity on top of inequity, which is how we get to this point of systemic and structural racism, of course. And I think you've described it very well, which is if you have a series of economic and other racial and ethnic disparities, you've got on top of that disparities in terms of access to the tools, access to the literacy to use them in a way, and that often comes from disparities in education. And then when a health crisis comes, it should surprise no one that more people die from certain communities where it is, public health messages can't reach, and where public health messages may not be as trusted in certain communities for good reason. Bad reason, but for understandable reasons. And so I do see these things all concatenated, and I think it does, it brings together this set of topics exactly as you suggested. Yesterday we joined MacArthur with the mayor and with President and Mrs. Obama and many others in a big effort that is going to try to get broadband to 100,000 school children in the next couple of years. I had the incredible experience of watching my daughter, who's 14, in the Chicago Public Schools this spring, access her Zooms and access her Google education accounts, and she, it was hard, but she sailed through a term. And just thinking about it, if you didn't have that, as you said, that that great computer, if you didn't have, in my Xfinity access isn't that great, but at least it's broadband. If you don't have the experience of working in these kinds of environments, like those kids are just completely out of luck for all the efforts that so many people made. And so maybe kicking it back onto the universal broadband theme, but part of it is, of course, making sure that happens, especially when you don't have the library to go to, right? You don't have even the McDonald's or the Starbucks to go to for the free Wi-Fi, right? On top of that, though, we have to support community-based organizations, of whom I consider libraries some, as well, to be the guides and to be those who are supporting these young people and all others who need this access. Otherwise, these health crises and every other crisis will just continue. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, though, on universal broadband and/or any of these things we've raised.
Yeah, definitely. Well, universal broadband is an area that I think my first half day at ALA, I was already talking about it, speechifying and writing about it, because it is a concern, like I said, that has really brought me back to the seat. I've been talking a lot about what I think were the great waves in librarianship. I think the first great wave of librarianship was this idea of adult literacy, because libraries were proliferating even when we still had 1/5 of our population, that identified as not having full literacy, not having reached full literacy. And if we looked at the African American community, more so, because we'll talk a little bit when we, talk about equity. I really want to talk about compulsory illiteracy, because we still live in the shadows of that. But when it comes to universal broadband, we spent a lot of time in libraries in our first wave, 19th, early 20th century, trying to reach, adult literacy, really trying to fully complete that work. And there's still a lot of work to do. The second wave, of course, was computer literacy, right? So we had like Microsoft and others, and I worked in a library in Hartford that was, for the state of Connecticut, our first 21st century library, right? So it was also dedicated as well to computer literacy. So we spent a lot of time in the basement of the Carnegie Library there, trying to show people how to use a mouse, and trying to show people, how to introduce them to, products so that they could, understand how to use Excel and how to understand how to use Word, et cetera. And I think the third wave of I think library and information services is really going to be about complete digital access. It's going to be about a ubiquitous internet for all, right? And so right now, I think the FCC is saying that somewhere about 21 million Americans like fully lack continuous broadband estimate. And I think even the commissioner said that that was an undercount. And I know according to Pew, to some of their studies, you know, there is this idea out there that even when people do have access, that we have about 28% of Americans who may not be using internet at all, may not be on any platform. And of course, the United Nations has said that they see universal broadband as one of their goals, and that's about to get like about 90% of the world's population, you know, within some kind of like broadband access. And we have a lot of researchers who are saying, well, that might not be able to be accomplished for, you know, 30 years yet. And I really don't think that we can wait. I don't necessarily think that broadband access alone will close the information poverty gap. But I do think that we will not be able to close that gap, which also is an extension of the kind of lived reality of poverty, unless we address universal broadband. So that is a focus for us at the American Library Association. You know, we're in our virtual event. I'm sneaking away. I opened our virtual event in lieu of our conference, which usually would have had about 25 to 30,000 people here in Chicago this week. But I opened it with that call, the call for rapid diversification of the field, which I'm happy to talk about, because I do think that libraries, like the Oscars, are too white. And I believe we are the measure of all things. So it isn't just the construct of race that concerns me, because race, you know, is a construct, but it is the reality that we just don't have the full representation in terms of library and information services, informatics, IT, for people to be really dedicating themselves to this work. And I think the zip code, you know, access for universal broadband is going to follow other investment or disinvestment lines, right? So the redlining of broadband for me is as pernicious as housing, which is, you know, the first area I worked in homeless services before I became a librarian. So I really applaud DPLA and its work around equity. But like John said, it can't be a tagline, because, you know, right now, you know what racism does, especially racialized capitalism. It co-opts all movements so that it can exist. We really have to, I think, universal broadband is going to push us, because it's going to mean that we are going to be focusing on both the urban and the rural poor. And I see it as a barometer of our effectiveness in the fight against racism when it comes to information access for all. So that's sort of where I'm thinking a little bit, and I want to hear, you know, more of what you have to say about that issue of universal broadband, John, and how MacArthur and how your work with DPLA is manifesting around that area.
Thank you, Tracie. And I couldn't agree more with what you've said. I think universal broadband is necessary but not sufficient when it comes to addressing these issues of structural racism and various inequities across our society. And so, absolutely, I think it is a frontier that we have to tackle. And I applaud you and ALA for taking it on. I think if these days any communities didn't have electricity connecting them, which is relatively few at this point, or didn't have, you know, heat or something in the community, I think we wouldn't accept that. And when we have an experience like the COVID period, when schools are shut and libraries are shut, I think it lays bare this notion that the broadband access is the same thing, that it should be treated as a public utility in this way, and it should be a universal starting point, as you say, and much more has to be built on top of that. But without it, it's extraordinarily hard to operate. And you raised such an interesting point, which is very, very high penetration of mobile devices through society, and that is a good thing. But you can just doing your homework or accessing this a job application or whatever on a narrowband or a paper hour kind of thing, it just doesn't work well. And so it just is sort of a necessary element, I think, of existing at this moment. And so I think we should absolutely drive it. I think you make an interesting and important point earlier, which comes back here about philanthropy. There are very few foundations that are focused on libraries. And I think too few. When I was chair of the board of Knight Foundation, we made a significant pivot there, and shout out to John Bracken, who made that case along with me, and we funded a fair amount in addition to DPLA around innovation, and of course Gates for a long time did, and all the funders of DPLA, and I'm glad that MacArthur is a tiny one in supporting DPLA are doing it, but there just is too little philanthropy in libraries, and I do think it's a cheap date in some ways, in the sense that I don't think it's not as expensive as some of the things that we fund, and I think the payoff is so incredibly high. And as you said, Tracie, it just touches so many different topics. So though we are not a major funder at MacArthur, and it's not it's a part of what we have done in terms of supporting the Obama Presidential Center's new library in the South Side of Chicago and so forth. All of us can do more, and I think that's the moment we're in, is really grappling with and trying to understand how we can do more, how we could drive forward something like universal broadband. Well, maybe we could pivot to the equity issue that you and I have touched on a few times, but obviously there's so much more to be said, and I really do think that the reckoning, which is in part a reckoning more on the part of white communities, which are I think addressing or scales falling off from eyes in a more definitive way than in the past. Communities of color are crucial to this, of course, and ought to lead, but it's not as much news, I think, the equity discussion in many communities. I feel like one of the things that will be so interesting is to say, how do we define that equity agenda for libraries, just as we have to define the equity agenda for each of our different institutions? So at MacArthur, we've adopted something called the Just Imperative. Here in the United States, it is centered on, although not exclusively on, race and ethnicity, given the American history of slavery and so forth. So it doesn't mean we don't do work around disability inclusion, but we see these things as intersectional. We've tried to define what we mean by equity in those ways, and then bring an equity lens to our grant making. But I'd be curious, as you now stand for the field in this crucial role, what's the equity call that you put out to all libraries and to DPLA as a supporting community for libraries?
Yeah, so it really has been around rapid diversification of the field, because fully 80% of librarians are white, right? So that means that we are just out of pace with diversity in this country. And it also means that a default for the practice of librarianship has been, even our cataloging rules are AACR rules, and all my librarians out there know that means Anglo-American cataloging rules. So we have to decolonize the profession. We have to do that, and we have to recognize that that means that we have to have people in leadership roles who are going to be able to represent the information needs of the full spectrum of residents and communities in this country. So that's call number one. I think the other thing that I want to think a little bit about is I want to think about how do we continue to talk about racial equity in this country, and without talking about libraries and information services, because the first recognizable civil rights protest, it happened in 1939 in a library, and that has been considered to be in a library in Alexandria, Virginia, when Black residents sat in the library, and because it was segregated. And what we see now is that we still see a lot of de facto segregation in terms of the resources, that are that are given to libraries and what libraries within the same city, jurisdiction, or town might look like. And especially, and I'm going to close here because I want to move on to talk about digital literacy and data enfranchisement. It's really look at also the erosion of school libraries. In my career as a librarian, right, I have seen ALA was founded almost 150 years ago in Philadelphia. We were in Philadelphia for our midwinter conference, and in Philadelphia, which is still a largely city, people of color there, people of color residents there, there were only 8 school libraries left in the school district. That erosion of school libraries, I mean, I can even just talk about school libraries if we want to trace inequity, but I think the erosion of school libraries, who gets them and who does not, speaks to our disenfranchisement, our inequity in terms of where dollars go in a city. So that for me is, again, I'm talking about barometers. Where can we in our lifetime and in our investment actually see progress or see the lack of progress or actually see a regression? And I think that we can see it in the field within our ranks, and we can also see it in things like school libraries and access. So I want to move on to this notion of digital literacy and data enfranchisement. When I think about digital literacy, we've been talking around it a little bit, but we're talking about technological skills and access. We're talking about authorship. We're talking about representation. We're talking about social responsibility in that area. I'd like to ask you a little bit about your work as the leader of one of the world's, and certainly the nation's, most recognized philanthropic organizations. We started off talking about the future of reading, but I wanted to ask you specifically about your concerns around digital literacy and what I call data enfranchisement, the ability that people have to access data in real time that can influence their behaviors as well as assist them with decision making.
Yeah, Tracie, it's a great frame and a necessary one, and I might even start with the one that you started, which is access to the data that would save your life, right? And in this COVID crisis, so it is a difference of life and death for people in communities. They're Latinx communities, they are Black communities predominantly, and if you do not have access to these data, you do not trust these data, it actually literally can kill you. And I think we saw some of that in the last several months. I don't have an empirical study to say it, but I suspect that all of us would accept what we've encountered. And so it's a crucial life and death issue. I'll actually scroll back to my last job when I was principal of a high school, and on this topic, because I cannot imagine operating a high school without having a school library and having school librarians who would help guide kids and teachers alike in this school environment of today. And I think it is, early on that young people get access, and I'm talking about high school, but it certainly goes way beyond that and earlier than that. I just think librarians are crucial guides to this much more complicated digital environment. And as you say, the data are out there. It's not that the data don't exist. They may not be created in the most equitable way. They might not be distributed, but they're, by and large, one can get access to it, but it is not happening evenly. The future is not being evenly distributed in this way. And I actually think such a crucial piece of that story is school librarians and librarians that people end up trusting. And I think it's a lot about a trust gap, which is if we create communities in libraries and around libraries that have people that the young people are going to trust, I think that comes back to your diversity question, right? So if the profession doesn't actually map to something, it doesn't have to be that only white people can talk to white people and Black people talk to Black people, obviously, but if in our libraries, whether it's in schools or in communities, we don't have an equitable, we don't have a diverse community, it's not going to work that well. So all of these things I think are going to connect back to this literacy question. And I think it's an economic travesty if it doesn't happen, but it can be a health travesty and all sorts of other things, which are so deep and so important. So anyway, I'd really just underscore what you were thinking about. We had also this topic of access to think through and to talk about, and I'd be just curious how you experienced and how the libraries you represent and work with have experienced this last period where when, you know, so the game plan of having access to libraries, I suppose it has redlining involved, it has all sorts of bad things involved. Hopefully some of that is getting more addressed over time as libraries are recited in different places. But even that imperfect footprint of libraries was shut down, obviously, abruptly in the context of COVID. And so access then became whether you had digital access or whether you had access, you know, through something mobile, I guess, or otherwise, right? I'm curious how you saw libraries experience that, and what lessons can we learn going forward, and maybe for the DPLA community to reflect on, you know, absent the access to physical libraries, how do we make equitable access in a digital environment?
This is the question of the day right now, and I'm so glad you're centering that. We could spend all day, so I'm going to be really quick and just say an area that we've really been focused on at ALA, and that is prisons, services to people who are incarcerated and detained, because that's where we have seen a correlation between access and the desire to monetize that, right? That access in a way that is so palpable. So we've seen a rapid shift in libraries, you know, which were very print bound. And as a younger person, as a poet, I used to teach in prison, and I used to teach poetry in prison. And so I spent time, you know, obviously supplementing the books that I had access to what the prison library had access to. And, you know, and print then was where it was. Today, we are seeing people who are detained being charged sometimes 20, 30 cents a minute, or a bundle of $1 for 3 minutes. And you know, like, you know, if you've ever had family, you know, in prison, friends, you know, in prison, you know, people don't have that much money on the books. I'm gonna keep it real right now. So we know that there is a coming wave, and I would say that the disenfranchisement is starting in prisons, and we need to be paying attention to it. But I think we're going to see that if we're not able to talk about reading as a human right and how reading needs to be free of cost barriers, then I think that we're going to be in a world of hurt, John. And I would say the reason why we're focusing on prisons at American Library Association is because that's where we see, along with school libraries, a real erosion of library services, and it being the difference between, as some have told us, some people who are in prisons, even knowing that COVID-19 was happening. So what I want to close with here, I see John, is I just want to close with this question about community access, right? I want to close as we begin with this notion of a correlation between a social responsibility and our recognition of our social responsibility in race, and then also the rise of this pandemic and our efforts to contain it. I am really interested in community informatics, how people can use technology to actually make a difference in their socioeconomic mobility. As I close, John, with feeling like this is the next wave for both philanthropy as well as libraries, for DPLA, ALA, as well as MacArthur, where would you direct us? What last word would you give us as we're thinking about reading, access to technology, and equity?
Tracie, thank you. And noting the time and noting that it's super important that you have the last words, I had the first word. What I would direct us back to is your beautiful piece about front lines and fault lines that you recently published. I couldn't agree with it more. So what I'm going to do, if it's okay, is give it back to you to make that case, and then Felton will take over from there. But it's been a treat talking with you. Thank you for everything. And I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with everybody.
Thank you so much, John. It was very gracious of you. And I can't wait to jump in here with my old colleague, Felton. We spent a lot of time together at some key points in our life. And I would just say that what I talk about in terms of front lines and fault lines is really about the fact that we cannot proactively confront a pandemic unless we deal with our racism, and that ALA, as well as DPLA, and all of us, we are going to have to look at information equity and access as paramount as we go forward. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to end there and turn it right over to you, Felton.
All right. Well, thanks, Tracie, and thanks, John. I think on behalf of our board of DPLA, we're very excited about what a fantastic discussion we had. I mean, it was really, really interesting. And I think all the folks who were asking questions were finding their questions that were being answered as you guys were talking. So thank you very much for a fantastic discussion here. I just wanted to speak to 2 points that you guys discussed. I think, you know, as a respondent, I just wanted to put something out there on behalf of public libraries, and then we'll turn it over to question and answer. First, to the point of universal access, I think it's really interesting how public libraries are kind of put in the middle in this situation, because public libraries have always been kind of the space of last resort for people who to get access. And in many ways, library directors have kind of used that as a way to go out and receive funding, but that's not the space that we want to be in. Being able to get access for an hour a day is not what we want our community to be able to do. So we've got to push the idea of broadband and universal access, but we have to realize that that is going to be a way. How can we work with our communities to figure out what are the ways that we can create different consortiums in the meanwhile while we wait to get to that point. I know a lot of folks are going to be advocating on behalf of universal broadband, but it's going to take some time. So in Cleveland, we were very fortunate that our Cleveland Foundation recognized, they went and did a study, and they found out that for community members who didn't have access, and we are the 4th least connected city in the nation, they found out 70% of those folks went to the public library. So they saw us as an immediate partner, and we started in this consortium, which now has 70 people, figuring out how do we create a mesh network using all of the folks that are around there to start doing that. So community and folks who are on this call who are looking at different ways they're doing it, I think you want to make sure that your community recognizes that while you may be the space of last resort, that is not what you want to end up being. And secondly, me and Tracie have had this discussion around equity for a really, really long time. And I mean, you know, going back to E.B. Josie, he's been talking about it. He started talking about it over 50 years ago. And we are actually in a worse spot today than we were 50 years ago, as far as the diversity of our profession. So, you know, I say to folks that we have to start thinking about it in a different way. You know, ALA and PLA and all of the associations you will see, everyone has been trying to figure out a kind of top-down strategy where we have to look at it a bottom-up strategy. It's incumbent on everyone who's on this call who can make some form of decision on who gets hired to try to move away from the library legacy hiring that has been historic. And, you know, I know folks see themselves as allies. You got to be seeing yourself as a co-conspirator, right? You got to be saying yourself that I got to break some rules. Sometimes I've got to work and just wail against the folks who are you're 6 to 1 in a hiring discussion, and 6 want this person, and you know this person's going to be better overall for the organization, and they're a person of color. You got to be willing to fight the good fight, right? And I think that's one of the things that we have kind of been just accepting over time, but those times have to be gone, or our profession will continue to be the way it is today. So with that, and that said, I just want to be able to turn it back over to John. He's got a number of questions that are there, and I know people have been sending things through chat as well, and we will work to close it out with you guys.
Thank you so much, Felton. Tracie, I saw you left the comment, though. I'd love for you to articulate that for those of us for folks who might not be reading the chat.
Yeah, I was just agreeing wholeheartedly with what Felton was saying, and I just wanted to say, you know, when I talk about rapid diversification in the field, I just want to say that I was hired in a library capacity before I was a librarian. I was, you know, a social worker. And I was hired by Seattle Public Library, and they said, we are breaking the rules, because normally someone would need to have a master's degree in librarianship. You have a terminal master's degree, but not in librarianship, and we need your skill set here, which was someone who could do street outreach, who worked in informatics, especially public health informatics. And that's when I fell in love with libraries. But I absolutely agree with Felton. We have to break the rules if we want to get further. And I think that it also means it's some work that we're doing here. We're trying to find that space. What is that space between the library and the community? And how do we take the library, how do we begin to own that space and make sure that we are spanning that that distance or that disconnect?
Yes, thank you guys so much. I guess I want to put in one touch. I got a note from a member of our community saying, apologize for not being able to be on this call because she's in the process of, her institution's going through a process of layoffs. And I know that runs too often, that runs directly counter to the promise of the experience that you just described, Tracie. That so talking to folks in our community, often the first folks to get affected by layoffs are the folks who are, coming in early career, and often folks who don't look like your traditional librarianship approach. So I want to acknowledge the reality of that economic conflict and how we, makes it even more important, I think, for us as those of us as library leaders to stand up and lean into that. One thing I wanted to tee up while Felton's here is one of the questions that came up in the Q&A. You guys were amazing that you answered a lot of the questions on the fly. And I open this to all three of you, which is, what is the role for DPLA in digital inclusion with regards to access to ebooks? And I know that's something that I've talked to all three of you about at various points.
So I guess one of the things I think DPLA could do is something that they've already done, especially in this time of COVID. I think the exhibit on the Spanish pandemic, the Spanish flu that we have available, the virtual exhibit is amazing. I mean, I think what we continue to do at DPLA is try to open up people's lives to understand how history will affect our future. And we see it every day of what happened in the Spanish flu. And unfortunately, we're still not learning anything from those type of things, but that's always what we're trying to do. During this period of COVID in Cleveland, what we've been doing is documenting. We had a number of journalists that were fired from the newspaper during this period of time. We hired them to start kind of working to document the history of this time, especially in the communities of color, so that we can go back somewhere in the future and be able to create an exhibit about what it was like to live during COVID-19, especially in our communities that are often overlooked.
I love that example, Felton. And just to tie it back to what Tracie was saying about co-creation, to think about, in a moment where journalism is going through this incredible crisis, where the voices who are going to be telling the stories now and in the future are, need to be more diverse. That is something libraries can do and something DPLA can do. And I'm so glad to see that happening in real time here. Special shout out also to Felton, who is juggling family duties while doing this and helping his daughter move out of college. Just congratulations to you, Felton, for managing both a Zoom and that. Thank you.
I still have to pay for it, so good Lord.
Folks, I know we're close to time, but if you all are able to stick with us for a minute, I'm going to surface a couple of the questions in the chat, if that's okay. And I know Tracie's in particular got a thing to go, but if I can keep you for a minute, I want to put out two questions and maybe let a combination of the two or three of you, Felton, if you're still there. Desiree Goodwin is asking do you see academic and public libraries as having separate missions for the common goal of centering equity? Actually, I'm going to leave that question out there as a solo because that's a big question. I'm going to put that out. Felton, maybe I'll put that on your plate first, and Tracie and John, you guys dive in as you see fit.
I think, I really want to hear Tracie's thought on this, but I really believe that there's a common goal within the profession. And as we continue to see folks moving in and out of the academic and public world, right? I think those same values need to be the same whatever the institution is. But I want to hear Tracie's thought, because Tracie's kind of has done both.
Yeah, and I want to hear John's thoughts too. I agree with you, Felton. I think there's a porosity, right, between, within librarianship. But I think, Desiree, you have a very good question, because the way that I think the academy, the way that scholarship has set itself apart, maybe perhaps deliberately or not, has meant that there's an insularity. There is a way in which the knowledge sort of builds the cachet of an institution, as opposed to, I think, the ways in which hopefully, in good public librarianship, the impact has to be felt in the community in order for, the library to actually be viable. In order for libraries to be funded, there has to be a connection between the return on investment and what you see in community. But I do believe, and what we're seeing, I think, in this particular movement and in other movements around the world, is that when scholarship is put in service of the people, and here I'm borrowing on Audre Lorde, right? A lot of people don't recognize that Audre Lorde is a librarian. If you read her, you know that she is. If you're a librarian, you see the way that she thinks. But she graduated from Columbia University Library School in 1961. And she talks about putting your activism in service of the people, putting your scholarship, putting your art, right? As Tony K. Bomber says, art exists to make the revolution, undeniable, right? Or irresistible, she says. So I think that there should be a porosity. There's a necessary porosity in terms of types of librarianship, but I think we have to challenge academic librarianship and academia to be in service of the people. John, what would you say to that?
I'd say just the same, Tracie. I've worked only as a director of an academic library, not in a public library, and I just think that the missions need to be basically the same. And having seen it from within an academic library, I believe there's a long way to go there in getting to that view. And just hearkening back to the beginning discussions for DPLA, one of the sort of thought experiments was, if a university library like Harvard's or any of the other big, great research libraries were available to every community college student, just as one way of thinking about it, how different would the world be, right? That's just a thought experiment, but it's not a crazy one from my view. But it's not true, right? It's not the reality. So I think if you imagine access in that different way, and of course public libraries have a version of that and something to do with that, I think we'd have a different world, and I think it would be a better world.
Felton's colleague on our board, Dr. Elaine Westbrooks, just is on the chat. And Elaine, I don't know if you've got access to your microphone, but I know this is a topic that is relevant to your work and thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I've been thinking about my entire career. And I agree with the panelists in that the research libraries, the academic libraries definitely need to step up. I think there are two areas though. I mean, you have public institutions who are of the public and for the public. And then you have private institutions who have a mission that tends to be a little smaller. But I think regardless of whether you're a public or private university or college, there is definitely that need for racial equity and to focus on social justice. And like Tracie was saying, I mean, I always go back to the beginning of the profession and how social justice is a core part and value of the profession, and we seem to forget that. And we act, like academic libraries didn't have social justice as part of the training, dating back, 75, 100 years. But I do think that through organizations like the Association of Research Libraries and other consortia, we are looking more at interrogating our systems and trying to understand how we can create a more just society. And we're thinking about democracy and what we do when we build collections, how we build collections for whom, who's represented, and how are they organized and described. And so I think that's that collection is that big thing that separates research libraries. And that's something that we are making some progress in, but we need to do a lot more to move the needle with regard to racial equity.
I don't know, Elaine, I didn't give you a proper introduction, but Elaine is also on our board and as the Dean of Libraries at the University of North Carolina, and we're so lucky to have her. Denise Stephens is my boss and our board chair, and Denise, no doubt you have opinions and points of view on some of these questions. I want to give you the mic for that. And two, her job is to also be the clock manager, no doubt, and let me know that we are 5 minutes over. Denise, I'm going to see if as you move for adjournment, if you want to touch on any of these questions, and to make it extra enticing, I will throw out one more point, which is in the stream, which if you want to touch on, you can, because I realize this is also a book, which is, are we over-credentialed as a field? Is a master's unnecessary? But with that, I hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, John. Well, now I won't touch the credentialing question, dude. I won't go there because I think that that's a huge issue. And some arguments would say that we are under-credentialed, depending on what the role is and what the institutional culture is. But I will say, as a library leader in a private institution, a private research institution, I echo everything we're saying, is that libraries are, an enduring and essential cultural institution. And we can't exist, and I don't think we can exist with any effect, completely shut out or apart from our communities and our, it is a rare case that even at the most cloistered private university library, that there isn't some desire and some practice toward being available to and a part of the community that we serve. And we sense that service to that community to be well beyond our institutional boundaries. So yes, I think we are definitely on the right track here in terms of that conversation, and I'm very personally happy to hear it. That being said, we are at the end of our time plus. I want to thank everybody who participated today. I want to thank John and Tracie in particular for your thoughtful discussion, reflective discussion. I think that was very informative for me, and I think hopefully for our participants as well. And that being said, we're going to adjourn